Welcome to your personal deep dive. Today, we're going to tackle citations. You know those little footnotes and bibliographies? You might think they're just a chore, but there's actually way more to them than meets the eye. And if you've ever wondered why we even bother with all these rules or felt kind of lost when it comes to MLA formatting, this one's for you. I've got someone amazing to help us unpack it all. Expert speaker, you've spent years exploring the ins and outs of citations. What is it about citations that really fascinates you?
It's funny, most people just see citations as like a tedious thing they got to do, just a box to check to avoid plagiarism. But the truly fascinating part is how citations actually reveal how interconnected knowledge really is.
Okay, I'm already intrigued.
Yeah, think about it. Every single time you cite a source, you're not just acknowledging that piece of information, you're putting your work within a larger conversation. You're linking your ideas to like a chain of thought that goes way back in history.
So it's like we're all building this giant web of knowledge together, and citations are the threads that connect it all.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so much more than just avoiding getting in trouble. It's about building credibility,
Hmm.
showing you've done your research, and like weaving your ideas into the fabric of intellectual history.
Speaking of history, have you ever come across any of those stories about, major historical figures or even court cases where it all came down to one single well-placed citation?
Now that you mention it, I do
Hmm.
remember reading about a legal case where a crucial piece of evidence was thrown out. It was all because
Wow.
of like a bad citation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it totally changed how the trial ended up. So I guess what you're saying is that citations aren't just for like academics. They actually have real world implications in all sorts of fields.
Absolutely. Think about journalism. Like a journalist's credibility completely depends on being able to back up their claims with solid sources,
Right.
or even in business. Like citing data and research can be the difference between a successful pitch and one that totally flops. Wow, I'm starting to see citations in a whole new light. So it's not just about following the rules, it's more about building trust, showing your authority, and being a part of this ongoing conversation of ideas.
Precisely. And that brings us to one of the core reasons we cite sources,
Hmm.
giving credit where it's due. It's a matter of being ethical, acknowledging where ideas come from, and respecting intellectual property. I mean, after all, nobody wants to be accused of stealing someone else's work, right?
Right. But I think a lot of people, myself included, sometimes trip up on figuring out what exactly plagiarism is. I mean, we all know that just copying, pasting whole paragraphs is a big no-no, but I have to admit, sometimes I'm not sure if something I've paraphrased or reworded still needs a citation.
You're definitely not alone there. The lines can get blurry, especially when you're dealing with complex ideas or trying to put together information from a bunch of different sources.
So how do we deal with those gray areas? What are some of the less obvious ways that plagiarism can sneak in?
Well, one that often catches people is using images. You might think that grabbing a quick picture from Google Images is no big deal, but actually, even those random pictures are protected by copyright.
Hold on, so even if it's just a picture of a cat or a landscape, I still need to cite it.
Unless it specifically says it's free to use or you get permission from whoever owns the copyright, yes. It's all about respecting ownership and being upfront about where you got your materials. Think about it this way. If you were a photographer and you spent hours getting that perfect shot, wouldn't you want to get credit for your work?
You're absolutely right. It's like basic respect for the creator and their effort.
Yeah.
What else should we be careful about?
Another sneaky form of plagiarism is copying the structure and organization of someone else's ideas, even if you've completely reworded the content.
So it's not just about the words themselves, but the way the argument or analysis is put together.
Exactly. If you borrow someone else's line of reasoning without giving them credit, that's still a type of intellectual borrowing. You need to acknowledge their contribution to how the thinking is structured, not just the specific words used. And here's another one that might surprise you. Quoting an entire poem by an author who's still alive without permission is considered plagiarism too.
Really? I thought as long as you put the author's name, you were good.
While it's always a good idea to give credit for quotes, using an entire poem without permission is actually infringing on the author's copyright.
Ugh.
There are fair use guidelines that allow you to quote a little bit for things like education or critical analysis, but if you want to reproduce the whole thing, you usually need to get permission from whoever owns the copyright.
So if I'm analyzing a poem, I can quote a few lines, but copying the whole thing would be a no-go.
Exactly. You'd need to get permission from the author or publisher to use the whole poem.
Wow, this is so interesting. It's amazing how many little details there are to plagiarism.
And that's why it's so important to really understand how to cite your sources correctly. It's not just about avoiding getting penalized. It's about doing things the right way and engaging in responsible scholarship.
Okay, so now that we've talked about the why of citations and kind of dipped our toes into the tricky world of plagiarism, let's get into the practical side of things. We often hear about different types of citations, like works cited pages and in-text citations. Can you help us break down what those terms actually mean?
Absolutely. Think of your works cited page as a master list. It's like a full inventory of every single source you've used in your work. It's like the VIP guest list for your research paper, all formatted according to specific rules, usually MLA format.
So it's like a bibliography, but with a fancier name and like specific rules to follow.
Exactly. It serves a really important purpose. It gives your readers all the info they need to find your sources themselves if they want to learn more or double-check your information.
Oh, I see. So it's not just about accountability, it's also about transparency and encouraging others to dive deeper into the topic.
Precisely. Now, in-text citations. Those are like little breadcrumbs you leave throughout your writing. They guide your reader back to that master list, your works cited page. They're little nods you give to acknowledge a specific piece of information or an idea you borrowed.
So if I'm paraphrasing something from a book, I'd include a quick in-text citation to show where I got that idea, and that citation would link back to the full source entry on my works cited page.
You got it. They work together like a perfect pair to make sure everything is clear and properly attributed throughout your work.
This is starting to click. I used to feel kind of lost when it came to citations, but now you're breaking it down in a way that's making me want to learn more.
That's great to hear. And speaking of learning more, let's dive into MLA format. It can seem a bit intimidating at first, but trust me, it's all about logic and being consistent.
Okay, from what I've seen, MLA format seems to have a ton of things to keep track of. Authors, titles, dates, and a whole lot more.
I know, it can feel like a lot at first. But the good news is, the 8th edition of the MLA Handbook, which is what our source material is based on, actually made things a lot simpler.
Oh, thank goodness for that.
Right. So what are the most important parts of an MLA citation?
Yeah, what are those essential building blocks?
Well, imagine you're building a really well-organized sentence. You start with the author's name, then the title of the work, followed by any information about the container.
Container information. I'm not sure I get what you mean.
Think of a container as the bigger thing that your source is a part of. So like if you're citing an article from the New York Times, the container would be the New York Times. Or if you're citing a chapter from a book, the container would be the title of the book. It just helps give some context so readers know where your source fits in.
Ah, I see. It's like those Russian nesting dolls. Each source fits inside another one.
That's a great way to think about it. And after the container, you'd include stuff like the publisher, the date it was published, and the location of the source. That could be a specific page range in a book or the URL for an online article.
So the goal is to give enough information so someone could easily find the source themselves, like giving them a treasure map to follow.
Exactly. And the great thing about MLA format is that it's flexible. It can be adapted for all sorts of sources. Now, you mentioned earlier that sometimes you're not sure if something needs a citation.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I'm constantly second-guessing myself, especially when I'm paraphrasing or summarizing someone else's ideas.
Well, let me ask you this. When you're working on a project or writing something, what's your main goal when it comes to the information you're using?
I guess my main goal is to present information in a way that's clear, engaging, and well-supported. I want my audience to feel like I've done my research and that I'm being accurate and ethical with the information.
That's a fantastic goal. And that's exactly where citations come in. They're not just about avoiding plagiarism. They're about strengthening those qualities you just described. Clarity, credibility, and engaging with information ethically.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like citations are super important for building that trust with your audience and making sure you're handling information responsibly.
Absolutely. It's all about creating a solid foundation for your work, one that's transparent and ethical.
Okay, I'm really starting to see the bigger picture here, but let's get back to the nuts and bolts of MLA format. You mentioned that the 8th edition streamlined things and focuses on a few key elements. Can you walk us through those? What are those essential building blocks?
Sure. Think of it like building a house.
Yeah.
You need a strong foundation, right? Well, in MLA format, that foundation is made up of 3 main things: the author, the title, and the container.
Okay, that doesn't sound too bad. The author is pretty straightforward, right? It's the person or group who created the work. But what about titles? Is it always as simple as just grabbing the title from the book cover or the top of the article?
Most of the time, it is that simple. But there are a few little things to watch out for. Like, If you're citing something short that's part of a larger work, like an article in a journal or a chapter in a book, you'll need to be clear about the difference between the title of the specific piece you're citing and the title of the larger work it's in.
Okay, I think I get that. So if I'm citing a chapter from a book called The History of Coffee, the title of my source would be the chapter title, and the container would be The History of Coffee.
Exactly. It's all about providing those layers of context so your reader understands where your source material comes from.
And this container idea applies to all sorts of sources, right? Not just books and journals.
Oh, absolutely. Think about websites. You might be citing a specific blog post, but the container would be the name of the blog or website itself. Or if you're referencing a YouTube video, the container would be YouTube.
So it's like acknowledging that every piece of information is part of a larger system of knowledge.
Exactly. And that brings us to those less traditional sources you mentioned earlier, things like social media posts and emails. They might seem out of place in a formal bibliography, but the same principles still apply.
I gotta be honest, I'm a little lost on how to cite a tweet or a Facebook post. Where do you even start with that?
You start with the same basic elements: author, title, and container. Let's say you're referencing a tweet from someone with the username @ScienceGeek, and it's about a new scientific discovery.
So at Science Geek would be the author, right?
Exactly. Then the actual content of the tweet itself, put that in quotation marks, and that becomes the title. And the container would be Twitter. You'd also include the date and time of the tweet as the publication date, and the URL of the tweet as the location.
I'm guessing that URL is super important because tweets can be deleted or changed, so having that permanent link is key.
You're right on the money. It's like giving the exact GPS coordinates for that specific piece of information in the huge world of social media.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about emails? They feel so personal and informal, not something you'd usually see cited.
That's true, but emails can actually be really important sources of information, especially if you're doing research that uses personal correspondence or original source materials.
So, how would we go about citing an email in MLA format?
You start with the basics, just like we talked about. The person who sent the email is your author. The subject line, put that in quotation marks, becomes the title, and instead of a publisher, you'd use the phrase "received by," followed by the recipient's name and the date they got the email.
Interesting. It's like you're documenting the actual communication itself, not treating the email like a published work.
That's exactly it. You're acknowledging that it's a personal exchange, but you're still giving enough information for someone to understand the context.
This is all making a lot more sense now. It feels less like trying to memorize a bunch of rules and more like understanding the principles behind it all.
That's what's so cool about MLA format. It's meant to be flexible and change with the times as we create and share information in new ways. We've been really focused on the mechanics of citations, but I want to go back to something we talked about earlier, the idea behind citations.
Yes. I really liked how you talked about citations as being more than just avoiding plagiarism. You said it's about being part of this larger conversation of ideas. Can we talk more about that?
Absolutely. Think about how knowledge is created. It's a process that builds on itself, like a tapestry made up of all these different ideas, discoveries, and insights. Every time we cite a source, we're acknowledging those who came before us, the people whose work we're building on.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It's like we're all part of this intellectual family tree carrying on the tradition of knowledge.
Exactly. And citations are how we trace that family tree, show how all these ideas are connected, and see where our own work fits in.
It's amazing to think about how citations have shaped history. Imagine if, like, those groundbreaking scientific discoveries or revolutionary philosophical ideas had been lost or attributed to the wrong person because of bad citations.
It's a scary thought. Citations are crucial for preserving intellectual history and making sure credit is given where it's due. They help us see how ideas have evolved over time, trace where concepts came from, and acknowledge the contributions of all those people who've shaped our understanding of the world. And in today's digital age, where information spreads so quickly and easily, the role of citations is even more important.
I see what you mean. With so much information available, it's easy to get lost and forget where ideas originally came from.
Exactly. Citations help us navigate that sea of information with integrity and purpose. They remind us that every piece of information has a history, a context, and a creator who deserves recognition.
It's like we're building this giant interconnected map of human knowledge, and citations are the compass points that help us find our way.
That's a great way to put it. And as we get better at using citations, We're not just becoming better researchers or writers, we're becoming more responsible and ethical members of this information age.
This has been such an insightful conversation, expert speaker. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of how to cite sources correctly, and I also appreciate the role they play in shaping knowledge and keeping things intellectually honest.
It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah.
I'm always happy to help people see citations from a fresh perspective. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listener with one last thought to chew on.
Okay, I'm ready. What's that final takeaway you want to leave us with?
As you keep learning and exploring, try to think of citations as like more than just a set of rules. See them as a way to really understand things better, like way to trace back where ideas came from and connect with this huge network of knowledge we're all a part of.
Yeah, that's a powerful way to look at it. It's not just about ticking boxes. It's about really engaging with the history of ideas and keeping that conversation of knowledge going.
Exactly. And as we get more comfortable with the how-to of citations, we'll actually find that they can make our own thinking and writing better. They can help us polish our arguments, make our evidence stronger, and just tell better stories overall.
I can definitely see that. When we carefully think about our sources and how they relate to our own ideas, it makes us think harder about the information we're presenting.
Absolutely. And this whole process of really evaluating sources and weaving them into our own work, that's a skill that goes way beyond just school. It's important for anyone who wants to be an informed and engaged person in the world today.
Totally agree. Whether we're reading news articles or trying to figure out political arguments or even just chatting with friends, being able to trace back information to its source and figure out if it's credible is super important.
You got it. It's about becoming smarter about the information we take in, being able to cut through all the noise and make good decisions about the ideas we encounter. And that's a skill that'll help you out in every part of your life.
This deep dive has been eye-opening, expert speaker. Thanks so much for sharing your knowledge and passion for this topic. I feel like I not only understand how to cite sources better, but I also get why they're so important for building knowledge and keeping things honest.
The pleasure was all mine.
Yeah.
I always love helping people see citations in a new light. Just remember, the world of information is huge and it's always growing. But if you have a good grasp on citations and you're committed to, engaging with knowledge in an ethical way, you'll be set up for success. You'll be able to navigate all the complexities out there and add your own unique voice to the conversation.
And for our listeners, if this deep dive has sparked your own curiosity about citations, make sure to check out the show notes. We've got a whole bunch of resources, guides, and tools to help you become a citation master. Until next time, keep those citations flowing and those minds expanding.